behind the golden gates of one of the world's most prestigious palaces, where every bow and curtsy follows centuries of tradition, a young princess discovered that true power doesn't come from a crown. It flows through your veins. What happened next would forever change how those closest to the throne understood the meaning of royal blood, respect, and the unbreakable bonds that tie a family together when the world is watching. The morning mist still clung to the palace gardens when James Whitmore adjusted his ceremonial sword for the third time in 10 minutes. After 15 years of service as a royal protection officer, he had witnessed countless moments of grandeur, scandal, and quiet humanity within these walls. But nothing had prepared him for what he would observe on that crisp Tuesday morning in October. James had been assigned to Princess Charlotte's detail for nearly 2 years, watching the young royal navigate the complex world of public duty and private growth. At barely 10 years old, she already carried herself with a poise that reminded him of her great-grandmother, the late Queen Elizabeth. Yet beneath that composed exterior, James had glimpsed moments of genuine childhood wonder and, occasionally, the fierce determination that seemed to run in her bloodline. The day began like any other. Charlotte had completed her morning lessons with her private tutor, Miss Helena Cartwright, a woman whose rigid adherence to protocol matched her perfectly pressed blazers. The princess had excelled in her French conversation practice and had shown remarkable progress in her understanding of constitutional history, subjects that would serve her well in her future role. As the clock struck 11, Charlotte made her way to the blue drawing room, where she was scheduled to meet with visiting dignitaries from the Commonwealth. These meetings were part of her gradual introduction to royal duties, carefully orchestrated by the palace staff to provide learning opportunities while maintaining appropriate boundaries for her age. James positioned himself near the ornate fireplace, his trained eyes scanning the room's occupants. The visiting delegation included several high-ranking officials, their wives, and a handful of prominent business leaders who had contributed significantly to various charitable causes. Among them was Sir Reginald Blackwood, a wealthy industrialist whose companies had extensive operations across 3 continents. Sir Reginald had arrived at the palace that morning with an air of self-importance that made even the seasoned palace staff exchange subtle glances. His booming voice could be heard echoing through the corridors as he regaled anyone within earshot with stories of his business conquests and social connections. He wore his wealth like a badge of honor, from his custom-tailored Seville rose suit to the ostentatious gold watch that caught the light every time he gestured. The princess entered the room with her customary grace, accompanied by Lady Sarah Pemberton, her lady-in-waiting, who served as both companion and guide during these formal occasions. Charlotte wore a navy blue dress with a simple pearl necklace, appropriate for her age, yet unmistakably regal. Her dark hair had been styled in a neat half-up arrangement that framed her face perfectly. The introductions proceeded smoothly, with each visitor offering the traditional bow or curtsy before exchanging pleasantries with the young princess. Charlotte responded to each greeting with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions about their work and their countries. James noted how naturally she seemed to connect with people, a gift that would serve her well in the years ahead. Sir Reginald, however, appeared to view the meeting differently than the others. When his turn came to be presented to the princess, he offered what could generously be described as a perfunctory nod rather than a proper bow. His handshake lingered longer than protocol dictated, and his smile carried an undertone that made James shift slightly closer to his charge. "Your Highness," Sir Reginald began, his voice carrying across the room, "what a delightful surprise to meet someone so young in such a position. In my business dealings around the world, I've learned that real power comes from making things happen, not from sitting in pretty rooms having tea parties." The comment hung in the air like smoke from a doused fire. Lady Sarah's eyes widened imperceptibly, and James felt his hand instinctively move toward his radio. The other visitors seemed frozen, uncertain how to react to such a breach of etiquette. Charlotte, however, remained perfectly still, her expression unchanged. When she spoke, her voice was clear and measured, carrying a gravity that seemed to age her beyond her years. "Sir Reginald," she replied, her blue eyes meeting his directly. "I appreciate your perspective on power and achievement. However, I think there may be some confusion about the nature of my position here." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle before continuing. "You see, you're a guest in this palace today. A welcome guest, certainly, but a guest nonetheless. I, on the other hand, am not here because of any invitation or business arrangement. I am here because this is my family's home, and I carry the blood of generations who have served this nation with dedication and sacrifice." The silence in the room was absolute. Even the antique clock on the mantelpiece seemed to tick more softly, as if aware of the gravity of the moment. Charlotte took a small step forward, her posture remaining perfectly erect. "The difference between us, Sir Reginald, is not one of age or experience in business matters. It is one of birthright and duty. You have achieved much in your career, and that is commendable. But you are a guest here today, while I am the blood that flows through these halls." James watched as the color drained from Sir Reginald's face. The man who had strutted into the palace with such confidence now found himself speechless before a 10-year-old girl who had just delivered one of the most elegant and devastating rebuttals he had ever witnessed. Lady Sarah maintained her composure, though James could see the slight smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. The other visitors stood transfixed, simultaneously uncomfortable and impressed by what they had just witnessed. Charlotte's voice softened slightly, but her message remained crystal clear. "I hope you understand that respect is not something that can be purchased or negotiated. It is earned through conduct and given freely when that conduct warrants it. Your achievements in business are impressive, but they do not grant you the privilege of disrespecting this institution or the people who serve it." The princess then turned to address the other visitors, her demeanor brightening as if the confrontation had never occurred. "Now, I believe you were telling me about the education initiatives in your region, Mrs. Pembroke. I'm particularly interested in the literacy programs you mentioned." The conversation resumed, though the atmosphere in the room had fundamentally changed. Sir Reginald remained quiet for the remainder of the meeting, his earlier bravado completely deflated. When the formal portion of the gathering concluded, he was among the first to excuse himself, offering a proper bow to the princess as he departed, a gesture that had been notably absent upon his arrival. As the visitors filed out of the blue drawing room, James remained at his post, processing what he had just witnessed. In his years of service, he had seen senior royals handle difficult situations with grace and authority, but never had he observed such a perfect blend of dignity and firmness from someone so young. Charlotte lingered in the room after the others had departed, gazing out the tall windows that overlooked the palace gardens. The autumn sunlight streamed through the glass, casting a golden glow across her face. "Your Highness," James ventured, breaking the protocol that typically kept him silent during such moments. "If I may say so, that was handled with remarkable composure." Charlotte turned toward him, and for a moment she looked every bit the child she was, seeking reassurance and perhaps validation for what had transpired. "Do you think I was too harsh, James?" she asked, using his first name in the informal way she did when they were away from public scrutiny. "Mother always says that with privilege comes responsibility, and part of that responsibility is maintaining the dignity of the institution." James considered his words carefully. His role was not to offer opinions on royal conduct, but he sensed that this young girl needed guidance in processing what had just occurred. "Your Highness," he replied, "in my experience, true leadership is demonstrated not by avoiding difficult conversations, but by handling them with both strength and grace. What you displayed today was exactly that balance." Charlotte nodded, seeming to accept his assessment. She straightened her shoulders once again, the momentary vulnerability replaced by the composed bearing that had become her trademark. "I suppose there will be many more moments like this in the years ahead," she said, more to herself than to James. "People who believe that wealth or position gives them the right to diminish others, especially when they think those others are too young or too sheltered to respond appropriately." The wisdom in her words struck James as remarkable for someone who had not yet reached her 11th birthday. Here was a child who understood not only her current position, but also the challenges that lay ahead of her. Perhaps, James suggested gently, but today you've proven that you're more than capable of meeting those challenges. Charlotte smiled then, the first genuine smile she had displayed since the confrontation began. It transformed her face, reminding James that despite her royal bearing and mature responses, she was still a child learning to navigate an extraordinarily complex world. "Thank you, James," she said. "I think I'd like to spend some time in the garden now. The roses are particularly beautiful this time of year, don't you think?" As they made their way through the palace corridors toward the gardens, James reflected on the morning's events. He had witnessed something that would stay with him for the rest of his career, a moment when a young princess had defined herself not through anger or privilege, but through quiet strength and unwavering dignity. The story of what had transpired in the blue drawing room would eventually make its way through the palace staff, not as gossip, but as a testament to the character of the young royal they served. It was a reminder that true nobility comes not from titles or wealth, but from how one conducts oneself when faced with disrespect and challenges. Charlotte had shown everyone present that morning, including a seasoned protection officer who thought he had seen everything, that sometimes the most powerful responses come not from raising one's voice, but from speaking with quiet certainty about who you are and what you stand for. The confrontation with Sir Reginald would not be the last time Charlotte would need to assert her position, but it would serve as a defining moment in her development as a future leader. She had learned that respect must be both given and commanded, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with swords or harsh words, but with dignified truth. As they stepped into the garden, the autumn air crisp against their faces, James realized that he had been privileged to witness the emergence of a royal who would one day lead not through fear or intimidation, but through the quiet confidence that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you represent. The weeks following the incident with Sir Reginald brought an unexpected shift in the atmosphere around the palace. Word of Princess Charlotte's composed, but firm response had traveled through the diplomatic circles, though the details remained carefully guarded within the walls of the royal household. James noticed how the staff members looked at the young princess with a new kind of respect, not the automatic deference due to her rank, but genuine admiration for her character. Charlotte herself seemed largely unaffected by the attention her actions had generated. She continued with her daily routine of lessons, charitable visits, and family obligations with the same steady determination that had always characterized her approach to royal duties. However, James observed subtle changes in how she carried herself during formal occasions, as if the confrontation had unlocked a deeper understanding of her own authority. The next significant test of this newfound confidence came during a state dinner honoring the visiting prime minister of a Commonwealth nation. These events were elaborate affairs, steeped in centuries of tradition and attended by hundreds of distinguished guests from around the world. Charlotte's role was typically limited to the receiving line, where she would greet selected visitors before retiring to her private quarters for the evening. The guest list for this particular dinner included several controversial figures whose invitations had sparked debate within the Foreign Office. Among them was Ambassador Viktor Petrov, a man whose diplomatic career had been marked by both significant achievements and persistent rumors of corruption. His presence at the dinner table had been requested specifically by the visiting prime minister, despite the reservations expressed by several senior palace officials. James had reviewed the security briefings for each guest, and Petrov's file made for particularly interesting reading. The ambassador was known for his charm and intelligence, but also for his tendency to push boundaries in diplomatic settings. He had a reputation for making provocative statements designed to test the resolve and knowledge of his hosts, particularly when he perceived weakness or inexperience. On the evening of the dinner, Charlotte took her place in the receiving line alongside her parents and other senior royals. She wore an elegant dress appropriate for her age, with the family's signature sapphire jewelry catching the light from the crystal chandeliers above. Her preparation for these events had become more sophisticated over the months, including briefings on the background and interests of key guests she would meet. The receiving line proceeded smoothly through the first hour, with Charlotte demonstrating the conversational skills she had developed through countless similar events. She asked thoughtful questions about each visitor's work and showed genuine interest in their responses, creating moments of connection that left lasting positive impressions on the guests. When Ambassador Petrov approached her position in the line, James noted the slight change in the man's demeanor. Where other visitors had shown appropriate respect and warmth, Petrov's expression carried a calculating quality that suggested he viewed the interaction as an opportunity rather than a courtesy. "Your Royal Highness," Petrov said as he executed a perfunctory bow. "How delightful to meet such a young representative of this great nation. I wonder if you've given much thought to the complexities of international relations and the challenges facing smaller nations in today's global economy." The question was clearly designed to put Charlotte in an uncomfortable position. A child her age would not typically be expected to engage in discussions of such complexity, and any stumbling response could be interpreted as evidence of the royal family's disconnect from serious global issues. Charlotte, however, had learned from her encounter with Sir Reginald. She met Petrov's gaze directly and considered her response for a moment before speaking. "Ambassador Petrov," she replied, her voice carrying across the immediate area with perfect clarity. "I find that the most important aspect of international relations is understanding that every nation, regardless of size or economic power, deserves respect and fair treatment. My studies have taught me that true leadership in global affairs comes not from exploiting perceived weaknesses, but from building partnerships based on mutual understanding." Petrov's eyebrows rose slightly, clearly not expecting such a sophisticated response. He leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on a more challenging tone. "Admirable idealism, Your Highness, but surely you understand that the world operates on more pragmatic principles? Those with power and resources naturally guide the direction of international affairs. It's simply the way things work." The conversation had drawn the attention of nearby guests and staff members. James felt the familiar tension he had experienced during the Sir Reginald incident, sensing that another crucial moment was approaching. Charlotte's expression remained serene, but James could see the slight tightening around her eyes that indicated her growing displeasure with the ambassador's tone. "Ambassador," she said, her voice still pleasant, but carrying an unmistakable edge, "I believe there may be a fundamental difference in our understanding of how power should be exercised. You seem to suggest that might makes right, that those with resources should dictate terms to those without." She paused, allowing her words to register before continuing. "In my family's tradition, we believe that true power lies in service, in using whatever privileges we have been given to lift others up rather than to maintain dominance over them. Perhaps that's why this nation has maintained its relationships with Commonwealth partners for generations, not through coercion, but through respect." The ambassador's confident smile began to fade as he realized he had underestimated his young conversational partner. Other guests in the immediate vicinity had turned to listen more closely, creating an audience for the exchange. "Furthermore," Charlotte continued, her composure unwavering, "I think it's important to remember that while you represent your nation admirably in your official capacity, you are here tonight as our guest. The principles of hospitality and mutual respect that govern such occasions should perhaps take precedence over attempts to score diplomatic points through confrontational discussion." The message was clear, and Ambassador Petrov's face flushed slightly as he recognized the subtle rebuke. He had attempted to embarrass a child in a public setting, and instead found himself being diplomatically but firmly corrected by someone a fraction of his age. "Of course, Your Highness," he replied, his voice notably quieter than before. "I meant no disrespect. Your perspective on international cooperation is refreshing." Charlotte's smile brightened immediately, as if the previous tension had never existed. "Thank you, Ambassador. I hope you enjoy the remainder of the evening. The chef has prepared some exceptional dishes featuring ingredients from across the Commonwealth, which I think beautifully demonstrates how collaboration can create something greater than the sum of its parts." As the ambassador moved on through the receiving line, visibly chastened, James marveled once again at Charlotte's ability to handle challenging situations with such grace and intelligence. She had not only defended herself, but had also articulated a clear philosophy about leadership and international relations that would have impressed seasoned diplomats. The story of the exchange spread quietly through the gathered guests, enhancing Charlotte's reputation as someone who should not be underestimated despite her youth. Several senior diplomats made a point of seeking her out later in the evening to express their admiration for her handling of the situation. Lady Sarah, who had witnessed the entire exchange from her position nearby, approached Charlotte during a brief break in the receiving line activities. "That was masterfully handled, Your Highness," she said quietly. "Ambassador Petrov has a reputation for testing people, particularly those he perceives as inexperienced. You turned his own tactics against him quite elegantly." Charlotte nodded thoughtfully. "I've been thinking about what happened with Sir Reginald, and I realize that some people will always try to use my age against me. They assume that being young means being naive or unprepared. But I've had access to some of the finest education and guidance in the world. There's no reason I shouldn't be able to hold my own in these conversations." Her insight demonstrated a maturity that went far beyond her years. She had learned not just to respond to challenges, but to anticipate them and prepare accordingly. The remainder of the evening proceeded without incident, but James noticed how differently the guests interacted with Charlotte during the informal portions of the dinner. There was a new level of respect in their demeanor, as if they had recalibrated their expectations based on what they had witnessed during the receiving line. One particularly telling moment came near the end of the evening when the visiting Prime Minister approached Charlotte to thank her for her hospitality. Their conversation, which James observed from a respectful distance, was conducted entirely as a dialogue between equals rather than the typical adult-to-child interaction that had characterized such exchanges in the past. "Your Highness," the Prime Minister said, "I wanted to personally thank you for your graciousness this evening. Your comments about Commonwealth cooperation were particularly insightful. I hope we'll have opportunities to continue such discussions in the future." Charlotte's response reflected the same thoughtful approach she had displayed throughout the evening. "Thank you, Prime Minister. I look forward to learning more about your nation's perspective on regional cooperation. I believe there's great value in understanding how different countries approach common challenges." Their handshake at the conclusion of their conversation was firm and respectful between two individuals who recognized each other as serious participants in the diplomatic process. As the last guest departed and the palace staff began the process of returning the formal areas to their normal state, James reflected on what he had witnessed over the course of the evening. Charlotte had not simply defended herself against another inappropriate challenge. She had demonstrated a level of diplomatic skill and intellectual sophistication that established her as a formidable presence in royal circles. The transformation was remarkable to observe. In the span of just a few weeks, a young girl had evolved into someone who commanded respect not through her title alone, but through her demonstrated ability to engage with complex issues and challenging personalities. Charlotte's preparation for these encounters had clearly intensified following her experience with Sir Reginald. James had noticed her spending additional time in study sessions with her tutors, focusing particularly on current affairs and diplomatic history. She had also begun requesting briefings on the guests she would meet at formal events, asking detailed questions about their backgrounds and interests. The investment in preparation was paying dividends in her increased confidence and effectiveness during public appearances. She was developing into exactly the kind of royal that the institution needed for the modern era, someone who could bridge the traditional ceremonial aspects of the monarchy with the substantive engagement that contemporary society demanded. As Charlotte bid goodnight to the staff members who had assisted with the evening's events, James noticed the genuine warmth in her interactions with each person. Despite her growing command presence in formal settings, she had lost none of the natural kindness that had always characterized her personality. "Thank you all for making tonight such a success," she told the assembled staff. "These events require so much coordination and attention to detail. Your professionalism makes it possible for us to represent the family and the nation with dignity." Her acknowledgement of the staff contributions was both gracious and genuine, reflecting an understanding that royal events were collaborative efforts requiring the dedication of many people working behind the scenes. Walking back to her private quarters with Lady Sarah and James following at a respectful distance, Charlotte seemed to be processing the evening's events. When she spoke, her words revealed the thoughtful analysis that had become characteristic of her approach to royal duties. "I'm beginning to understand that every public interaction is both an opportunity and a test," she said. "People will always be evaluating whether I'm worthy of the position I was born into. The only way to meet that challenge is to be prepared and to stay true to the values I've been taught." Her reflection demonstrated a wisdom that would serve her well in the years ahead, as public scrutiny of the royal family continued to intensify and the challenges facing the institution grew more complex. The evening had marked another significant milestone in Charlotte's development as a future leader, proving that she possessed not only the intelligence and preparation necessary for royal duties, but also the strength of character needed to maintain dignity under pressure. The months that followed the state dinner brought new challenges and opportunities for Princess Charlotte to demonstrate the leadership qualities that were rapidly becoming her trademark. James had been reassigned to her primary detail permanently, a decision that reflected both his experience and the trust that had developed between the protection officer and his charge. Their professional relationship had evolved into something approaching mentorship, with Charlotte often seeking his perspective on the complex situation she encountered. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it the traditional series of garden parties and charitable events that marked the royal social calendar. Charlotte's role in these gatherings had expanded significantly, moving beyond simple appearances to include substantive participation in planning and execution. Her input was being sought on everything from guest lists to program content, reflecting the family's confidence in her judgment and growing maturity. The most significant test of her developing diplomatic skills came during a particularly challenging charitable fundraiser organized to support education initiatives in developing nations. The event had attracted wealthy donors, government officials, and representatives from various international aid organizations. The guest list was carefully curated to maximize both fundraising potential and global impact, but it also included several individuals whose presence created underlying tensions. Among the attendees was Margaret Sinclair, a wealthy philanthropist whose charitable work was widely respected but whose personal views often sparked controversy. Sinclair had built her fortune through technology investments and had used her wealth to fund educational programs around the world. However, she was also known for her blunt speaking style and her belief that traditional institutions, including monarchies, were outdated obstacles to social progress. James had reviewed Sinclair's background extensively, noting several instances where her interactions with government officials had resulted in heated exchanges and negative publicity. Her invitation to the event had been debated at length by the palace staff, but her significant financial contributions to the cause had ultimately secured her place on the guest list. The fundraiser was held in the palace's staterooms, with Charlotte serving as the primary host for the younger attendees, while senior royals managed the more formal aspects of the event. Her preparation had been more extensive than usual, including detailed briefings on each major donor and their particular interests and concerns. Charlotte moved through the gathering with practiced ease, engaging donors in conversations about their philanthropic work and the specific projects they hoped to support. Her genuine interest in educational issues and her informed questions about implementation challenges impressed even the most skeptical attendees, who had expected little more than ceremonial pleasantries from someone her age. The confrontation with Margaret Sinclair began innocuously enough. Charlotte approached the philanthropist during a break between formal presentations, hoping to thank her personally for her contributions to the evening's cause. "Ms. Sinclair," Charlotte began with her customary warm smile, "I wanted to express my appreciation for your generous support of tonight's initiatives. Your work in educational technology has made such a significant impact around the world. Sinclair's response was cordial, but carried an undercurrent of challenge that immediately put James on alert. "Thank you, Your Highness. Though I have to say, I sometimes wonder whether events like these are the most efficient way to address serious global problems. All this ceremony and tradition seems rather wasteful when there are children who need schools and teachers." The comment was clearly designed to provoke a defensive response, suggesting that the royal family's approach to charitable work was more about appearances than results. Several nearby guests turned to listen, sensing the potential for an uncomfortable exchange. Charlotte, however, had anticipated such criticism and had prepared her response accordingly. "I understand your concern about efficiency, MS. Sinclair, and I think it's a valid point worth discussing. However, I would suggest that events like tonight serve multiple purposes beyond simply collecting donations." She gestured gracefully toward the assembled guests, her voice carrying clearly through the immediate area. "The people gathered here tonight represent different sectors of society, different perspectives on how to address educational challenges, and different resources that can be brought to bear on these problems. The value of bringing them together goes beyond the financial contributions they make." Sinclair's expression sharpened, clearly not expecting such a thoughtful response. "That's an interesting theory, Your Highness, but I found that real change happens when resources are deployed directly and efficiently, without the overhead of elaborate social gatherings and traditional hierarchies." The challenge in her words was unmistakable, and James felt the familiar tension that preceded moments when Charlotte's authority would be tested. Other guests in the vicinity had stopped their own conversations to focus on the exchange between the young princess and the outspoken philanthropist. Charlotte's posture remained perfectly composed, but James noticed the subtle shift in her expression that indicated she was moving into what he had come to think of as her command mode. "Ms. Sinclair," she replied, her voice taking on a more formal tone while remaining respectful, "I appreciate your perspective on efficiency and direct action. Your results in the field speak for themselves, and they're genuinely impressive. However, I think there may be a fundamental difference in how we understand the role of institutions in creating sustainable change." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to register before continuing. "You see, while direct intervention can address immediate needs effectively, lasting change often requires the kind of coordinated effort that can only come from bringing diverse stakeholders together around common goals. Traditional institutions like this one serve as neutral convening points where people with different interests and perspectives can find common ground." Sinclair's eyebrows rose slightly, clearly surprised by the sophistication of Charlotte's argument. She leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on a more confrontational edge. "That's a very diplomatic way of defending an outdated system, Your Highness. But at the end of the day, aren't you just justifying your own privileged position by claiming it serves some greater good? What real contribution do you make to solving these problems beyond hosting elegant parties for wealthy donors?" The question hung in the air like a challenge thrown down at a medieval tournament. James felt his hand instinctively move toward his radio, though he knew that no physical intervention would be appropriate for this kind of confrontation. Charlotte's response came after a moment of thoughtful consideration, her voice carrying a gravity that seemed to age her beyond her years. "Ms. Sinclair, your question touches on something I think about every day, what it means to serve in a position I didn't earn through my own achievements, and how to use that position responsibly. You're absolutely right that I was born into privilege, and that privilege comes with obligations that extend far beyond hosting events." She gestured toward a display board showing photographs from various educational projects supported by the foundation. "Every initiative represented here tonight has benefited from the unique platform that this institution provides. We can open doors that might otherwise remain closed, convene meetings between people who might never otherwise collaborate, and lend credibility to causes that might struggle for attention in a crowded marketplace of charitable appeals." Charlotte's voice grew stronger as she continued, her conviction evident in every word. "But more than that, I believe that service, real service, means using whatever advantages you have been given to lift others up. Whether someone's platform comes from inherited position, business success, or technological innovation, the measure of their worth isn't the source of their influence, but what they do with it. The silence that followed was profound. Sinclair stood motionless, clearly processing the unexpected depth and thoughtfulness of Charlotte's response. The other guests who had gathered to witness the exchange seemed equally impressed by the young princess's articulation of her philosophy of leadership. Charlotte wasn't finished, however. She took a small step closer to Sinclair, her voice softening but losing none of its authority. You've achieved remarkable things through your direct approach to philanthropy, and I genuinely admire that. But I would suggest that our different methods aren't contradictory, they're complementary. Your work in the field creates the programs and innovations that events like tonight help to scale and sustain. The traditional institutions you criticize provide the stability and convening power that enable lasting partnerships between innovators like yourself and the broader community of supporters. Sinclair's expression had shifted during Charlotte's response, moving from confrontational to genuinely thoughtful. When she spoke again, her tone had lost its sharp edge. That's a more nuanced perspective than I expected, Your Highness. I'll admit that my experiences with traditional institutions haven't always been positive, and perhaps that has made me too quick to dismiss their potential value. Charlotte's smile returned immediately, warm and genuine. I think that's exactly why conversations like this are so important, Miss Sinclair. When we only interact with people who share our perspectives, we miss opportunities to learn and grow. Your criticism of inefficiency in charitable work is valid and important. It pushes all of us to be more thoughtful about how we use resources and measure results. The transformation in the atmosphere was remarkable. What had begun as a confrontational exchange had evolved into a substantive discussion about different approaches to philanthropy and social change. Other guests who had initially watched with concern now listened with genuine interest as two intelligent women worked through their different perspectives. James observed the conclusion of the conversation with professional satisfaction and personal pride. Once again, Charlotte had taken a challenging situation and transformed it into an opportunity for meaningful dialogue. Her ability to acknowledge valid criticism while defending her own position showed a maturity and diplomatic skill that would serve her well throughout her career. The interaction with Sinclair had another significant outcome that became apparent as the evening progressed. Word of the exchange spread among the attendees, but rather than creating negative publicity, it enhanced Charlotte's reputation as someone capable of engaging seriously with complex issues. Several major donors approached her later in the evening to discuss their own philanthropic work in greater detail, treating her as a peer rather than simply as a ceremonial figure. One particularly meaningful conversation came with Dr. James Okafor, a Nigerian educator who had been working to implement technology-based learning programs in rural communities across West Africa. His discussion with Charlotte revealed her deep knowledge of educational challenges in developing regions and her genuine interest in finding sustainable solutions. Your Highness, Dr. Okafor said during their conversation, I was impressed by your exchange with Ms. Sinclair earlier. It demonstrated both maturity and wisdom to acknowledge the validity of her concerns while defending the value of your own approach. That kind of intellectual honesty is rare in diplomatic settings. Charlotte's response reflected the thoughtful analysis that had become characteristic of her approach to royal duties. Thank you, Dr. Okafor. I've learned that the most productive conversations happen when everyone involved is willing to consider that they might be wrong, or at least incomplete, in their understanding. Ms. Sinclair raised important questions about efficiency and accountability that deserve serious consideration. Their conversation continued for nearly 20 minutes, covering topics ranging from teacher training programs to the role of technology in bridging educational gaps between urban and rural communities. Dr. Okafor later told colleagues that he had been impressed by Charlotte's grasp of implementation challenges and her insightful questions about sustainability and local ownership of educational initiatives. As the evening wound down and guests began to depart, Charlotte took time to personally thank each major donor for their participation. Her interactions with each person demonstrated the individual attention and genuine interest that had become her trademark approach to royal duties. The final interaction of the evening came with Margaret Sinclair herself, who approached Charlotte as she was preparing to leave. "Your Highness," Sinclair said, her manner notably different from earlier in the evening, "I wanted to apologize if my earlier questions seemed overly aggressive. I tend to be direct to a fault, and I sometimes forget that passion for a cause doesn't excuse rudeness to one's hosts." Charlotte's response was gracious and thoughtful. "Please don't apologize, Miss Sinclair. Your questions were exactly the kind that need to be asked. If we can't defend our approaches to people who are genuinely committed to the same goals, then perhaps we need to reconsider those approaches." I found our conversation challenging in the best possible way. They shook hands with mutual respect, and James noticed that both women seemed to have gained something valuable from their exchange. Sinclair had encountered a young royal who could engage seriously with substantive criticism, while Charlotte had successfully defended her position against a formidable intellectual opponent. As Charlotte made her way back to her private quarters, accompanied by Lady Sarah and James, she seemed energized rather than drained by the evening's events. Her encounters with challenging guests had become opportunities for growth and learning rather than ordeals to be endured. "I think I'm beginning to understand something important," she said as they walked through the quiet palace corridors. "The people who challenge me most directly are often the ones who care most deeply about the same issues I care about. They're not trying to be disrespectful. They're trying to ensure that the work is being done as effectively as possible." Her insight revealed a sophistication in her thinking about leadership and public service that impressed James enormously. She was learning to distinguish between opposition based on genuine concern and challenges motivated by less noble purposes. The evening had marked another significant milestone in Charlotte's development, demonstrating her growing ability to handle complex diplomatic situations with grace, intelligence, and genuine engagement. Her reputation within charitable and diplomatic circles continued to grow, based not on her title alone, but on her demonstrated competence and character. James reflected on how much Charlotte had grown since that first confrontation with Sir Reginald. She had evolved from a young girl, defending her position, to a confident leader, engaging productively with criticism and challenge. The transformation had been remarkable to witness, and it boded well for her future effectiveness in royal duties. As summer arrived with its promise of longer days and expanded public engagements, Princess Charlotte's role within the royal family continued to evolve in ways that surprised even the most experienced palace observers. James had been witness to her transformation from a precocious child into a formidable young diplomat. But nothing had prepared him for the events that would unfold during what should have been a routine visit to a children's hospital in London. The visit had been planned months in advance as part of Charlotte's introduction to the charitable patronages that would eventually become her primary responsibility. The hospital specialized in treating children with complex medical conditions and had received significant support from royal charities over the years. Charlotte's role was intended to be largely ceremonial, meeting with patients, touring new facilities, and participating in a ribbon-cutting ceremony for a new research wing. James had conducted his usual advanced security survey of the location, noting the carefully planned route through the hospital and the extensive media coverage that would document Charlotte's first major solo charitable engagement. The hospital staff had prepared for weeks, ensuring that every detail of the visit would reflect positively on both institutions involved. What none of them had anticipated was the presence of Dr. Michael Harrison, a renowned pediatric surgeon whose recent public statements about healthcare funding had created significant controversy within medical and political circles. Dr. Harrison was respected for his surgical skills and dedication to his patients, but he was also known for his uncompromising views on healthcare policy and his willingness to confront political figures whom he believed were failing to adequately support medical research and treatment. The doctor's presence at the hospital during Charlotte's visit was not accidental. He had specifically arranged his schedule to coincide with her tour, driven by a belief that royal patronage of medical charities was little more than publicity theater that did nothing to address the systemic funding problems facing the healthcare system. Charlotte began her visit with characteristic warmth and professionalism, spending extended time with young patients and their families in the pediatric wards. Her preparation for the visit had included briefings on each child she would meet, allowing her to engage with them about their interests and treatments in ways that went far beyond superficial pleasantries. James observed how naturally she connected with the children, showing genuine interest in their artwork, their favorite books, and their hopes for the future. Her ability to bring joy and distraction to children facing serious medical challenges was remarkable to witness, and the hospital staff were clearly impressed by her authentic engagement with their patients. The confrontation came during the planned tour of the new research facilities, where Charlotte was scheduled to learn about ongoing studies into childhood diseases and innovative treatment approaches. Dr. Harrison had positioned himself in the research center's main laboratory, where he would inevitably encounter the royal party as they moved through their planned route. When Charlotte entered the laboratory with her escorts and the hospital's senior administration, Dr. Harrison stepped forward from his position near a complex array of research equipment. His approach was direct and purposeful, immediately drawing the attention of everyone present. "Your Royal Highness," he began, his voice carrying a formal tone that barely concealed underlying tension. "I'm Dr. Harrison, head of pediatric surgery here. I wonder if I might have a moment to discuss some concerns about the healthcare funding crisis that's affecting our ability to treat the children you've come to visit today." The hospital administrators who had planned the visit looked visibly uncomfortable with this departure from the carefully choreographed schedule. Charlotte, however, showed no sign of being flustered by the unexpected encounter. "Of course, Dr. Harrison," she replied with genuine interest. "I'm here to learn about the important work being done at this hospital, and that certainly includes understanding the challenges you face in providing care to your patients." Dr. Harrison had clearly expected a more evasive response, and Charlotte's willingness to engage seemed to catch him slightly off guard. Nevertheless, he pressed forward with his planned confrontation. "The reality, Your Highness, is that while royal visits generate positive publicity for hospitals like this one, they do nothing to address the fundamental problems facing our healthcare system. Children are dying because we lack the resources to provide optimal treatment, and symbolic gestures like today's visit actually make it easier for politicians to avoid taking real action." The challenge was direct and harsh, delivered in front of hospital staff, media representatives, and several families of patients who had been invited to witness the royal visit. James felt the familiar tension that accompanied moments when Charlotte's authority was being tested in public settings. Charlotte's response demonstrated the diplomatic skills she had developed through her previous encounters with challenging personalities. She remained calm and thoughtful, considering Dr. Harrison's words carefully before responding. "Dr. Harrison, your concerns about healthcare funding are clearly rooted in genuine care for your patients, and I respect that enormously. You're absolutely right that symbolic gestures alone cannot solve systemic problems. However, I think there may be value in examining how different types of support can work together to create meaningful change." She gestured toward the research equipment surrounding them, her voice carrying clearly through the laboratory. "The research center we're standing in today exists because of a combination of government funding, private donations, and corporate partnerships. The royal patronage that brings attention to this work helps generate the public support that makes increased funding politically feasible." Dr. Harrison's expression remained skeptical, but Charlotte could see that he was listening carefully to her words. She continued with growing confidence. "More than that, though, I think visits like today serve another crucial purpose. When I meet with the children in your wards, I'm not just generating publicity. I'm bearing witness to their experiences and their needs. That witness creates an obligation for me to use whatever platform I have to advocate for the resources and policies that will improve their lives." The doctor's stern expression began to soften slightly as he processed Charlotte's response. She had acknowledged the validity of his concerns while defending the value of royal engagement in ways that demonstrated genuine understanding of both the limitations and the potential of her position. Charlotte wasn't finished, however. She took a step closer to Dr. Harrison, her voice taking on a more personal tone while maintaining its authority. Dr. Harrison, you've dedicated your career to saving children's lives, often working under conditions that are far from ideal because of resource constraints. That dedication is admirable and necessary. But I would suggest that effective advocacy for healthcare funding requires multiple approaches, including both direct medical intervention and efforts to build public understanding and support. She paused, allowing her words to resonate before delivering what James would later recognize as a masterful conclusion to her argument. The difference between us is not in our goals. We both want the best possible outcomes for the children in your care. The difference is in our roles and the tools available to us. You save lives directly through your surgical skills and medical expertise. I work to create the social and political conditions that enable institutions like this hospital to thrive and expand their capacity to save lives. Dr. Harrison stood silent for a long moment, clearly processing not just Charlotte's words, but the unexpected sophistication and conviction with which she had delivered them. When he finally spoke, his tone had shifted significantly. Your Highness, I must admit that your understanding of these issues is more comprehensive than I expected. I'm accustomed to dealing with officials who offer empty promises and photo opportunities without any real commitment to substantive change. Charlotte's smile was immediate and genuine. I understand your skepticism, Dr. Harrison. Trust must be earned through actions, not just words. Perhaps we could discuss specific ways that royal patronage might be used more effectively to support the kind of systemic changes you believe are necessary. What followed was a 20-minute conversation that transformed the entire atmosphere of the visit. Dr. Harrison found himself engaged in a detailed discussion with a young princess who demonstrated not only emotional intelligence and diplomatic skill, but also substantial knowledge of healthcare policy and funding mechanisms. Charlotte asked informed questions about research priorities, treatment protocols, and the specific ways that funding shortfalls affected patient care. Her questions revealed preparation that went far beyond what would have been necessary for a ceremonial visit, suggesting that she had invested significant time in understanding the complex issues facing modern healthcare systems. The conversation drew the attention of other hospital staff members who gathered to listen as their respected colleague engaged in substantive dialogue with the royal visitor. Several senior doctors and researchers found themselves drawn into the discussion, contributing their own perspectives on the challenges and opportunities facing pediatric medicine. James watched this transformation with professional admiration and personal pride. Once again, Charlotte had taken a potentially hostile encounter and converted it into an opportunity for meaningful engagement and learning. Her ability to acknowledge criticism while defending her position had created space for productive dialogue rather than defensive confrontation. The most significant moment came when Dr. Harrison suggested specific policy changes that could improve healthcare outcomes for children. Rather than offering vague promises of future consideration, Charlotte pulled out a small notebook and began taking detailed notes. These are exactly the kinds of concrete recommendations that I can bring to policy discussions, she told the doctor. Would you be willing to provide me with written summaries of these proposals? I'd like to ensure that your expertise informs the charitable strategies we develop going forward. Dr. Harrison's response revealed how completely the dynamic had shifted. Your Highness, I would be honored to contribute to such discussions. I apologize for my initial approach today. I'm not accustomed to encountering officials who are genuinely interested in substantive engagement with these issues. Charlotte's response demonstrated both grace and wisdom. Please don't apologize, Dr. Harrison. Your passion for your patients' welfare is exactly what I hope to encounter in these visits. If royal patronage is going to make a real difference, it needs to be informed by people like you who understand the challenges from the ground level. The remainder of the hospital visit took on a completely different character from what had been originally planned. Instead of a ceremonial tour with superficial interactions, it became an intensive educational experience that provided Charlotte with detailed insight into the realities of modern pediatric medicine. Dr. Harrison personally guided her through the research facilities, explaining ongoing studies and their potential impact on treatment outcomes. His earlier hostility had been replaced by genuine enthusiasm for sharing his knowledge with someone who demonstrated real interest in understanding and supporting his work. The media coverage of the visit reflected this transformation, focusing on Charlotte's substantive engagement with healthcare issues rather than simply documenting ceremonial activities. Several major newspapers ran feature articles highlighting her informed questions and her apparent commitment to evidence-based approaches to charitable work. More importantly, from Charlotte's perspective, the visit established her reputation within medical circles as someone who could engage seriously with complex policy issues. Dr. Harrison became an informal advisor on healthcare matters, providing her with regular updates on research developments and policy recommendations. The relationship that developed from this confrontational beginning would prove to be one of Charlotte's most valuable professional partnerships. Dr. Harrison's expertise and credibility within medical communities gave her access to cutting-edge research and policy thinking, while her platform allowed her to amplify his advocacy for improved healthcare funding and policy. James reflected on the visit as they returned to the palace that evening. Charlotte had faced her most challenging public confrontation to date and had emerged with enhanced credibility and new professional relationships. Her ability to transform hostility into partnership demonstrated diplomatic skills that would serve her well throughout her career. Charlotte herself seemed energized by the day's events, reviewing the notes she had taken during her conversations with hospital staff and discussing ideas for follow-up actions. Her engagement with the healthcare funding issues raised by Dr. Harrison had clearly sparked genuine intellectual interest that went beyond her ceremonial obligations. "James," she said as they traveled back to the palace, "I think today taught me something important about the difference between defending your position and actually earning respect." Dr. Harrison wasn't interested in protocol or courtesy. He wanted to know whether I understood the issues that mattered to him and whether I was serious about making a difference. Her insight revealed the ongoing evolution in her thinking about leadership and public service. She was learning to distinguish between different types of criticism and to respond appropriately to each. "The people who challenge me most directly," she continued, "often turn out to be the ones who can teach me the most." Dr. Harrison's initial hostility was actually a sign of his passion for his work and his patience. Once I demonstrated that I share that passion, we could work together rather than at cross purposes. This understanding would prove crucial in her subsequent royal duties, as she encountered increasing numbers of people who judged her on her knowledge and commitment rather than her title alone. The hospital visit marked her emergence as a royal who could command respect through competence and genuine engagement rather than ceremonial authority. The transformation that James had witnessed over the months since that first confrontation with Sir Reginald was now complete. Charlotte had evolved from a defensive child, protecting her position, into a confident leader, actively seeking opportunities to learn and contribute. Her approach to challenging encounters had shifted from reactive defense to proactive engagement, creating opportunities for partnership and mutual learning. As they reached the palace grounds, Charlotte was already planning follow-up actions based on her conversations at the hospital. Her notebook contained detailed notes on research priorities, funding needs, and policy recommendations that she intended to discuss with charitable organizations and government officials. The young princess, who had once simply defended her bloodline against inappropriate challenges, had become a royal who earned respect through knowledge, empathy, and genuine commitment to service. James knew that he had been privileged to witness the emergence of a leader who would serve her nation and the broader world with distinction for many years to come.